You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Amanda Howell of Urbanism Next at the University of Oregon to talk about Sidewalk Robots. We chat about their study on sidewalk delivery robots with the Night Autonomous Vehicle Initiative and what they learned about community engagement and small delivery vehicles on city sidewalks. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks for supporting each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of zoning nerds and infrastructure wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Heavy knit bus or bike only, or lightweight bike only with fading checkerboard design. Sign up at patreon.com/theoverheadwire and I'll send one right along. You can also purchase the scarves at theoverheadwire.com. Get your fresh Elmo or fresh Kermit before winter arrives. Order now at theoverheadwire.com. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire Daily Newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. Well, Amanda Howell, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I am a researcher with the Urbanism Next Center at the University of Oregon, although I'm based in Portland. I have been doing this for almost 5 years. I do research on topics related to broadly new mobility and their impacts on cities. And so I've done research on micromobility, equity related to micromobility, autonomous vehicles, TNCs or transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, kind of everything that sort of falls under this new mobility umbrella and making sense of it. And really not from the standpoint of like, what is the technology itself, but more, what are the impacts? What are the benefits? What are the challenges? Is this something that we should be incorporating into our cities? And is it actually helping people? That's the work that I do.
I like that because when I read a lot of articles, especially when they're from kind of the trade papers of the technology industry, they're just like, this is what this company does, and this is how much money they raised, and this is, what the future is going to be like according to their CEO, who's very optimistic and is trying to raise money. And it's like, I want to know what the impacts are. I want to know what the situations are where this is actually useful versus, your kind of rosy outlook about your company.
Yeah, exactly. What are the use cases? Who is benefiting? Who maybe isn't set up to benefit? If it's something where there is the opportunity for a lot of people to benefit, if certain changes were made, are these changes that we should make? To what extent should we be helping to make sure that these services can be deployed?
Yeah. Well, so what was the first kind of introduction to micromobility or the technology infiltration of transportation in general? What was like your first introduction to the topic and how did you get into it?
Well, so I grew up in Los Angeles. So, in the very car-dominated culture. At the time, I didn't really realize that life could be different. I didn't realize that I didn't have to entirely rely on getting a ride from my parents, until I could drive myself around, that was even an option. And so then I moved to the Bay Area. I was in the Bay Area for a long time. I went there for my undergraduate education and started getting, more familiar. I lived there without a car. I started walking more. I started riding a bike around San Francisco and taking transit way more than I ever had in LA. And then what really actually kind of moved me into the transportation sphere. So I went back to school to study urban planning. And before I went back to school, I had been working with an organization in the Bay Area called Mount Tamalpais College now. It was the Prison University Project when I was there. And I worked with people who were incarcerated, but many of them were students who were getting out. And the incredible challenges that they were facing in terms of, not only finding jobs and finding housing, but getting to the places where they were able to find jobs and where the housing was located. It was so incredibly challenging for them to be able to navigate and move around. And I think that for me was sort of this like kind of clicking moment of like how, I had been really interested in housing and all these other issues and just like this idea that like, oh my God, like it seems so obvious, but like how do we get places? How do we get to the places we need to go? And how easy is it? And why have we made it actually, it's in so many places in the US so incredibly hard? That is where my interest in this all kind of stems from. Now I live in Portland. I thankfully am now in a place where like I barely ever drive. I bike commute. I occasionally ride scooters. I ride transit, and just being able to live in a place that has that level of access, I think that just has made me an evangelist for the fact that I enjoy my life so much more when I spend less of it in the car. Although I recognize I also want to be mindful of the fact that we have created cities and we've created the way our urban form is that, for many people, a car is, I think, in some ways a stopgap measure until we start to do a better job of creating places that are better connected with better, more convenient, fast transit. A car probably does have its place, but I'd like to continue to move towards, a future where people don't have to rely on a car to get to where they need to go. And that micromobility can be a component of it. Because I think that, I had fun. I love riding.
I'm interested in the idea of incarceration for a long period of time and then getting out and trying to get places and trying to understand systems that might have changed a lot by the time you get out. And especially from a technology standpoint, if you think about back to 2009, I guess, when iPhone came out, that's only so many years. And there's been a huge amount of changes. And then there's been people, I imagine, that have been in prison since that time.
Oh, yeah.
That when they get out, it's like, what in the heck happened? Like, I went in and the Backstreet Boys were doing their thing, and then I'm out, and there's a crazy amount of technology change.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I was working with folks, this was 2013, 2014. iPhone had only been out like 7 years. And I was working with people who'd been incarcerated sometimes upwards of 20 years. So, and you're living, I think that being in that space, you're living in this microcosm. You're basically moving around between buildings. Pretty much everything's on foot from one place to another. And for a lot of those folks, the only times when they're even getting into a vehicle is, if they were being taken out for a medical, going out to a hospital or something like that, or being moved between facilities. So to then all of a sudden be, sort of given gate money and then told to go on your way and have to navigate this system that is incredibly complex with new technology to adopt. And, a lot of challenges in terms of like getting all the things that you need in order to operate in that world where you might not have your ID. Driving is not an option anyways, but then you also don't have, a debit card. So like the issues with cash and not being able to get on the bus and all this stuff. It's so complicated.
Yeah, sounds very difficult. Well, let's talk about delivery robots, shall we?
Yeah, let's pivot to that.
Well, so this project was initially supposed to be with autonomous delivery vehicles, but ultimately, because of the pandemic, you decided to go with sidewalk robots. I'm wondering how much thinking changed during the pandemic because delivery became such a big deal.
So that was a huge component of it. So originally the projects, this is for the Night Autonomous Vehicle Initiative that has been underway since 2018. There's 4 cities involved. It's Detroit, Pittsburgh, Miami-Dade, and San Jose. And originally, these 4 cities were selected because they had a lot of autonomous testing and deployment, and they also had pilots that were being planned to test autonomous vehicles. And actually, at the time when everything was starting, the idea was that they were primarily going to be testing autonomous passenger vehicles. And for a variety of reasons, the pandemic is one huge component of it, but I think that's actually just one component. The pilots started getting shelved or permanently shelved as part of the function of the pandemic, but also I think the business environment, the technology, there's been lots of articles I think written where it's like in 2017, 2018, it was like autonomous vehicles are going to be everywhere tomorrow. And then as we now know, of course, that's not true. And that it's a lot more complicated. And so it was kind of both of those things happening together in tandem that ended up, we then in early 2020, the pandemic's underway, the pilots that we'd been planned had been working towards, they were being shelved. And so we had these conversations around, okay, like people are at home, we've seen this huge uptick in deliveries. Is this a technology that we can test with personal delivery devices or sidewalk robots and see what does this look like in terms of actually trying to deploy these on city streets? Because for the most part, the delivery robots up until that point had largely been deployed on college campuses. That's where they'd been. But, at the same time, I think another pressure that was underway in 2020 and a little bit in the years before that was that a lot of states had started passing bills legalizing the operations of these devices on city streets. And I think there was kind of an increasing sort of concern from city perspective that, we really don't know that much about how these devices operate. And yet they're being legalized at the state level saying they can operate. And so we really feel like we need to learn more about what is that? What do they actually look like? Can they navigate our streets and infrastructure as they currently exist? Who stands to benefit? Who's maybe going to be left out if we deploy these? And so there was like a lot of driving forces that came into this idea that like, okay, this seems like a good time for us to try and pilot these delivery devices. And then, reaching out to different providers of the technology and kind of figuring out who would be willing to do this experimenting with us. Huge props to KiwiBot, because I think this was a big question mark of like, okay, we want to try deploying these devices on city streets. And not only that, we also really want to work together and we want to try deploying them and testing out use cases that you as a company might not otherwise do. We want to try testing delivery farm boxes to low-income residents in San Jose. That's probably not a use case they might have done on their own, right? So it was just a big experiment is really what it was that we did for 6 months in these 4 different cities.
Well, so why did the Knight Foundation want to get involved in this? Obviously, they have a certain view of what research they want to do, what initiatives they want to get behind. I'm curious what their interest was in this.
So the Knight Foundation has a couple of different big topics that they focus on. Obviously journalism is a huge component of it because this is the Knight family, the Knight brothers had all the newspapers, and 3 of these 4 cities, so the only one that isn't is Pittsburgh. They are all Knight cities. So they're cities where the Knight family had newspapers. And so, journalism is a big component of it. They also do a lot of work around public space. But one of the other things that another kind of pillar of work that they've been starting to focus on more and more is sort of smart cities and the idea of like, how are we engaging community around technological change? That's been an area of interest for them. And I think, again, kind of going back to like, I guess this would have been sort of late 2017, early 2018, they had 3 cities within the Knight sphere, San Jose, Detroit, Miami, were all sort of in this place where there were a lot of AV companies that are operating there, they're testing there, they're creating, test facilities. And all of these cities were also starting to play around with the idea of doing these AV deployments. And I think the Knight Foundation was sort of, from their perspective, was feeling like, okay, this is a really interesting place that's starting to develop, but we really feel like what's missing from these conversations so far is like, where's the community engagement? What's the community voice in this conversation? And so that was what the driving force behind the idea that they were going to invest in this initiative. And then Pittsburgh, they added, even though it's not a Knight city, because Pittsburgh, there's so much testing with Carnegie Mellon, the deployment of and creation of the technology, that it felt important to include them as part of the cohort. So that was the driving factor. And so the grant funding that they gave is really meant to fund community engagement around these topics and around autonomous vehicle technology.
You did do a lot of community outreach for this. I'm wondering what the results were in terms of reaching out to people. How did you reach out to people first off? And then also what kind of results or what kind of feedback did you get when you told them about these little robots that were going to go on the street?
Yeah. Well, this was kind of a funny project. I feel like it's important to note in terms of how it was set up because, I'm here in Portland because it was the pandemic and we were really limited in terms of our ability to travel. The engagement that was being done, I personally wasn't actually leading the engagement. The engagement was being led by folks who work for the cities in the cohort and also KiwiBot. So the city staff and KiwiBot staff were going out together to do engagement. And then I was meeting weekly to glean the learnings and hear, understand what they were hearing from these engagement events. And then I was helping sort of create engagement tools that they could use, like surveys and things like that. So I just caveat that a little bit because it's kind of a funny from a research standpoint to sort of be a little bit at arm's length from that. But so I think the engagement events that really had the biggest impact were truly the events. So in Pittsburgh, there were multiple times when they went to like local farmers markets with the robots and just had them out on the closed street and allowed people to interact with them that way and ask questions. Similarly, in San Jose, they went to a lot of sort of community events with the robots and did that work. In Miami, there was another organization involved where they had hired these community liaisons from different neighborhoods in Miami. And then they had an event with the community liaisons where the community liaisons could order something for delivery with the robots and then, have the experience of doing that. So a lot of it was event based. There was also just like having them out and about on the streets and, doing some intercept surveys where possible. So that happened more in San Jose. San Jose State University was also involved with helping do some of this data collection. So they had some urban planning students go out and do intercept surveys and do some observations of, what was it like when people interacted with these devices. And so, that was kind of the crux of how we did engagement. And I think, by and large, I think the themes that kind of stood out the most in terms of what we heard from folks is like, a lot of people said they were cute. That was like a common thing. Kids tended to be really excited around them. It was like fun to see them like drive around and they have faces and it was fun to see them open and close. So I think there was some like warm and fuzzies around that. There was also a healthy amount of skepticism of like, okay, like this is fun, but like, also, I have a hard time trying to imagine exactly what situation I would use these, like when would I use these? A lot of people did talk about like, what does this mean for jobs? What's the impact on jobs and delivery jobs if these are widely deployed? Some people express concerns around privacy, especially with having more things out in the world that have cameras, like what information is it taking in? What is it storing? So the feedback was overall, I think, fairly like positive and people were open to it, but there was also like a lot of questions around it. Like they wanted to know more. And I think that's also where it was really helpful that we, for most of these events, there was both a city staff member and then a KiwiBot staff member there together because the city staffer could speak to like, what was the goal of doing the pilot? And then having the KiwiBot staffer there, they could answer questions of like, okay, this is exactly how this technology works. This is what we're storing. This is, let's get into the nitty gritty of the tech and really try and answer as many questions as possible in those moments. So, I think that was like sort of overwhelmingly the experience with the engagement. There were also like Pittsburgh in particular, there were, especially when the pilot was first announced, there was a kind of fair amount of like not being so sure that people wanted these on city streets and feeling like, oh, we don't want like yet another thing that we're trying to navigate around, like some people are also still feeling like I'm still trying to deal with the scooters that are deployed and taking up space. And so this is just yet another thing. So that broadly, I would say were the overarching themes we heard in the engagement.
So these are sidewalk robots. If you were to explain what one of these KiwiBots look like, the kids obviously thought they were cute, but like what would you say their kind of dimensions are? What are, for folks listening, that you can look it up obviously, but I want to kind of get a feel for what size they are and how fast they go and what their kind of main operational standard is.
Yeah. So they're essentially the size of like a very small cooler is how I would describe it.
Like an igloo cooler?
Like a really small igloo cooler.
Yeah.
Like a picnic basket style cooler is kind of the way I would describe it. So that's kind of about the size. For most folks, it probably doesn't go a lot higher than like your mid shin. So it's pretty low to the ground. It does have a flag that sticks up off of it so that it has a higher profile with the flag. They're going about on average 4 miles an hour. So they're not going that fast on the sidewalks. I think they have the capacity to go faster, but that's how fast they were operating in the cities that we were deploying them on. And the front of the robots have sort of little digital faces. And so it can kind of make like a happy face or a sad face or put a heart on it or something. So it can, it's sort of being anthropomorphized in that way. And then, the way that you engage with it, so it rolls down the street slowly on the sidewalk, it crosses at intersections. And then when it gets to where the location is, that it's either picking up an item or delivering an item, someone has to come out to meet the robot. And then it opens like a clamshell. It just sort of opens slowly and then you can put something in it or take something out. And that's basically how it works.
It seems like it can hold like a sandwich or maybe an individual meal, right? Like that's kind of the size.
Yeah, it's pretty small. That's right. I think like you could probably have, depends on what you're ordering. You could probably have a couple of sandwiches delivered, maybe like 2 kind of tall lattes. Its capacity is pretty limited.
What does that mean for the companies that the pilot was trying to partner with? Were they like, yeah, sure, we want to deliver sandwiches in these vehicles or Mexican food or whatever it might be? What were the feelings like from the folks that you were trying to partner with in order to do some real world testing?
That is a great question. And that is definitely one of the, I think, biggest challenges that we came across over the course of the pilot. So KiwiBot approached a lot of local stores and restaurants in these 4 cities. And I think that, people were interested. Folks were like, oh yeah, it'd be interesting to try this technology. But at the end of the day, from the standpoint of rubber meeting the road, how does this actually work? There were quite a lot of challenges in trying to figure out how this would integrate into a business, especially with also just, I think with what everyone was dealing with too at the time, like limited staff and, COVID protocols and all kinds of stuff. There was already so much going on. And then on top of that, some of these places, they did end up working with a taco truck in Pittsburgh, but that truck didn't have an online menu to begin with, so KiwiBot ended up then having to help digitize their menu and then help create like an ordering platform, like things that didn't actually even exist before. So like that, I think, was the most kind of extreme versions of some of these challenges that in terms of trying to integrate with these businesses made it pretty difficult. And then also like, sort of inventory management is another thing. Like if businesses aren't necessarily used to doing a lot of online orders, and again, like I think everyone was like figuring this out during the pandemic and scaling up and doing a lot more of it. But, even so, like some places were like, yeah, that seems cool, but like that really isn't where my business is. People call and they place an order and they come and get it. And so, I don't know that like there's going to be the demand for it from my customer base. So, there were quite a lot of challenges in that regard in terms of actually like kind of onboarding, especially the small and local businesses, which is, I think, one of the things that we had really wanted to try, which, was to see like, what is it like to try and work with these smaller local businesses? Could this be like, from an economic development standpoint, can this be beneficial? And, I think the challenges of onboarding and then, moving forward for the folks who did actually end up using it, it's like, it was a fun novelty, but it's going 4 miles an hour. Like that's pretty slow.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of places were also just like, well, we're kind of already using these as our delivery services and that's working fine. Maybe it's imperfect, but this is what we've got going.
There was like a distance limit too, right? Like a mile
Right.
and a mile and a half as well for you all.
Right. Yes. The distance was basically between 1.5 mile to 2 mile radius delivery. So that's also a challenge. I think you're kind of getting at a lot of the questions around like, what are the really applicable use cases of this technology right now, given the limitations? You also, I think, in that limited or radius, you need a pretty high density of demand. And that doesn't exist in a ton of places, where you have a lot of places that are both like, you have local restaurants and goods and services and things, and then a lot of people living within that same small radius that are going to order that delivery. So, I think that raises questions like, okay, well, what are the sustainable use cases of this technology right now?
Do you think that doing the pilots kind of told you that small businesses really aren't the target for some of these robots and maybe it's something else?
I think as it currently stands, I would say yes. I think right now it does not feel like that's the target for this technology. And I'm not sure that there's like a huge value add from the business standpoint currently to use these devices for delivery, especially when you're having people deliver on, well, certainly by car, by bike, by foot, if they're going as fast or faster, that's probably not the best use of the technology right now.
Another thing is like, they're called personal delivery devices, PDDs, which is kind of a wordy way to say little robot or sidewalk robot. I don't know. Is there a way that you like PDD or sidewalk robot, or what's the term du jour? Like what's the best one to use?
I think sidewalk delivery robot is the thing that actually makes sense, right? It's like, okay, like
that's what it is.
That's what it is, right? Like if I don't work in this space, like a personal delivery device is like, that is strange. I think most people are like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And so like a sidewalk delivery robot, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing is that there was kind of a thinking about a pivot where, there might be some value in these robots, not just from deliveries, but from actually like mapping the infrastructure of a neighborhood because of the challenges that they encounter, kind of the similar challenges that pedestrians and people with disabilities and wheelchairs and others get all the time when they're trying to navigate a city. They even got hit by cars apparently a couple times because they couldn't see them taking a right turn, which there's a whole discussion nationally now after Washington, D.C. just banned right turns on red. So there's all these things that maybe you learned that they could do that maybe wasn't a use case before.
Yeah, absolutely. So that definitely was a big pivot. Basically, I think I would say midway through a lot of the pilots, which was that, okay, this idea that we could maybe serve small and local businesses and provide them with support in this difficult time. Okay, well, maybe this is actually not going to work so well. But, these devices are going to all these places and they're low to the ground and they have the opportunity, they have all this technology, like they do have the opportunity to collect infrastructure data that could be really valuable to cities to really identify like where are the cracks in the sidewalk and where is the sidewalk misaligned or where are obstructions, where do those exist. And so that definitely sort of ended up being a direction we started to try and move towards kind of mid-pilot along with KiwiBot of like, okay, well, what would it look like to use these devices for this purpose? And then it got into like interesting questions around like, well, this isn't actually the area that KiwiBot had originally gotten into. This wasn't what they had created the robots for. So then sort of trying to figure out, okay, well, what does it take to actually collect the types of data that is really valuable to cities? What is that data? How do we make sure that these two things kind of speak together, that they're collecting it in a way that's actually usable by engineers and city staff? And like all of that kind of ended up then be getting like really interesting questions, but then its own challenges, right? Of like, okay, like that was not their area of expertise. And so I think like kind of trying to figure out like, how do we have these folks who are kind of in some ways like sort of, for lack of a better way of thinking about it, like speaking a different language where you're like, now we're talking like an infrastructure language and there's like the really nitty gritty of like the details of exactly what the measurements that need to be taken in and stuff like that. And can KiwiBot sort of move towards doing this in a way that's actually going to be usable? So I think that's an interesting question. We kind of ended the pilot with that being where the direction that KiwiBot was trying to take it in. Ultimately, we weren't deploying for long enough and able to get to the point where we were collecting data that ended up really being usable by the cities. I think that's a direction that they are continuing to explore. But then I think it becomes a question of like, okay, well, so does the way it's built need to change? Like if it's going to actually collect infrastructure data but not do deliveries, does it need an insulated cooler? Like how does the design of it change as a result? Because now it's doing something entirely different.
Yeah, I imagine you could put LiDAR on it and then you need all of the memory into that space, or you need an accelerometer that collects when it bumps and stuff like that and those types of things. And they take up space, especially in those vehicles that are driving around San Francisco here. I can tell that they take up space.
Yes, definitely.
How was the pilot beneficial to the local staff, the city staff? I mean, obviously there's a way for you to take information and then use it because it was such a new technology and a new idea that you can use it to write regulations. But were there other ways that the local staff benefited from the pilots?
I would say, I think, yes, absolutely. Just the opportunity to work so closely with a tech provider and, get out in the field together and do that engagement was beneficial. And I think, we kind of talked about this a little bit in the report, but I think from the standpoint of when we started the pilots, there was this sense of like, oh my gosh, like these are coming so fast. We need to figure it out. We need to have a pilot program. They're going to be everywhere tomorrow. And I think the opportunity to really dig in and learn about the tech and try deploying it in different circumstances allowed everyone to sort of see up close, like, oh, actually, this is an opportunity, but this is a big challenge. And this challenge is going to take some time to figure out. So like, this actually isn't maybe as pressing as I felt like it was. And so there's more time to continue to iterate, to figure out like, what is the best way to deploy the technology? I think it gave them a sense of being able to kind of take a deep breath around some of this stuff, because I think that with tech, I do think that sometimes it can just feel like, oh my God, the walls are closing in and we have to figure this out. So I think that was a big benefit. I think it was kind of an unusual pilot in the idea of trying to really co-create these use cases with a tech provider. And I think that was really a beneficial thing for everyone involved of what does this look like to try and do this kind of partnership? How can we do this again? And what are we learning from it to continue to make it better?
What's interesting to me is that, we have all these other deployments of technology in the past for transportation, and they've gotten kind of mixed reviews or frustrated cities. So one of my questions is, were there lessons from this pilot project that you feel like the deployments of like, say, Uber or a Bird or somebody along those lines could have learned from if they would have, done something like this rather than just throw everything on the street and, shoot first, ask questions later?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it comes back to, and to sort of, I think, be reductionist, like building that trust. And so I do think that learning from this and the way that this pilot was structured allowed the cities and the tech provider to start to build trust at an earlier stage and try and start to build these relationships earlier on in the like testing and deployment of the tech. I mean, I think that this has been the ongoing challenge and conversation and discussion around, Uber and Lyft and micromobility and e-scooters and all this kind of stuff, is this sort of sense that I think a lot of city staff end up just kind of feeling like they're getting caught on their heels. And then everybody always feels like they're trying to play catch up. And I think that partnering earlier on, allowing staff to really see what the technology can do and is capable of, I hope that down the line, as we continue to see it develop, it allows for more thoughtful piloting and potentially kind of less antagonistic relationships where it feels like, okay, like this new technology, I mean, Uber and Lyft, micromobility, e-scooters, all this stuff, like these things are not all or nothing. Like it's not all bad. It's not all good. There are good things that have come of it. There are negative externalities. But I think that the way that those other services in particular were initially deployed, I think sort of ended up creating this environment where it just sort of feels like the cities are, just trying to play catch up. And then it just becomes sort of about regulation. And then there's like this like dynamic of like, we don't like the regulation and we don't want this and blah, blah, blah. I just think like trying to do this sort of private public partnership piloting earlier on will hopefully allow for a better service in the future that hopefully does serve more people. That's the goal.
Yeah. So there were three main objectives for the pilot: learn about the technology and potential issues, educate and engage the public, and then work with private sector companies. Looking back, which objective brought you the most interesting findings?
Well, I think they all yielded interesting findings. I do think number one ended up just being, which was learning about the technology. There was so much that we learned about the tech by doing this kind of deployment, just in terms of like things that I think we couldn't have anticipated otherwise. So for instance, in Detroit, KiwiBot had partnered with a restaurant that then, in order to go to the kind of main deployment area, the neighborhood of Corktown, which is where they were going to be doing deployment, the robot would have to cross Michigan Avenue, which is overseen by the state. So Michigan DOT, it's under their jurisdiction. And the robot could not get across the street before the light changed. So then it would kind of end up looking like it was running a red light because it couldn't actually get all the way across. That's something that we hadn't really thought of in advance of just like, that's really a limitation of our infrastructure, not the technology, but yeah, and how we've designed that. But I think that was a thing where then ultimately the way that we ended up having to deal with that, or they ended up sort of saying like, okay, well, this is becoming an issue. So we're just going to end up having to create a different path. And so we're going to have to avoid Michigan Avenue altogether. And we're going to take this like even more circuitous route, right, to delivery. I mean, I think kind of learning about the technology and the interactions within the environment, our built environment as it exists, I think was just absolutely fascinating. And I think that with the previous deployments primarily being on college campuses, like you just didn't really get to figure that stuff out before, because those campuses they're smaller, infrastructure conditions tend to be sort of better, or at least more consistent. And then again, like in Pittsburgh, right, it was like there were a lot of neighborhoods where the robots just couldn't even navigate because like there's like all these overgrown bushes and all these things. There's not like, well, they couldn't carry on the sidewalk. So, I mean, I think things like that. And then just also like in terms of weather conditions, what can they operate in and what can they not? I think that yielded really interesting learnings, being able to just really learn about the tech and see what it could do. And again, learn about the tech in relationship to our built environment.
Yeah. I feel like humans, when they get into that situation where they're forced to cross the street faster, you run across the street, even though you're a pedestrian, you have the right of way, you're like scared of the vehicles. So what does that mean for a robot? Like, well, they're not really scared, but they might get crunched. And then can you speed up? Can you slow down? Like, where would you go? It's all kinds of interesting things that happen when you learn about how, our infrastructure is failing pedestrians and cyclists in many different ways. And obviously it does the same for, sidewalk robots.
Yep.
So what's next for you all? Like, what's the next step? Is there another pilot coming? Is there more research about these PDDs? Is something else coming down the line?
So the Knight Foundation, the Knight AV initiative is ongoing through the end of 2023. We're not doing anything at this stage, anything more with delivery robots. That phase has ended. Really now the cities that we're working with have kind of moved into, they're doing different pilots and engagement work now. That one was a really unique and I think awesome opportunity for all four of them to do the same thing at once, which I mean had a ton of value. And I will just make a plug in terms of like, I think that's a great way, to the extent that some cities can work together and deploy something at the same time. There's a ton of learnings that can happen that way. So now the cities are doing different work. Miami-Dade currently has an autonomous shuttle running. It's at the zoo, so they're testing that out. Detroit is also working towards doing an autonomous shuttle deployment now. So the initiative is sort of moving in different directions, but ultimately I think like the goal and something that we're all continuing to work towards together is definitely sort of how can we continue to best prepare cities for further autonomous deployment. And so we, as Urbanism Next, and then in partnership with CityFi, who's also part of the Knight AV initiative, we're working on an autonomous vehicle playbook that we're putting out next year that, kind of pulls together a bunch of learnings from this multi-year effort of like, what does all this look like? And what do we learn from all these different engagement opportunities and things that have happened over the course of the initiative. So that's what we're working on now.
Awesome. Well, so if folks want to get a copy of the report or find out more about Urbanism Next, where can they do that?
Our website, urbanismnext.org, has all of our reports, including the most recent Sidewalk Delivery Robot report and information about Urbanism Next and the work that we do. And I will also note that we have an annual conference, and our next conference is coming up next April in 2023. So yeah, please, I would encourage folks to check it out.
Awesome. Well, Amanda, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed chatting about this.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.